What's up creators, I hope you're all doing well. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Tony Fuentes. Today we're again returning to the Edit series where we break down the styles of famous photographers, movies or creators and try to replicate their color grading in post-edition with the purpose of learning and understanding how to achieve certain looks. Now the profile that we're going to break down today is my personal favorite, which is Maté Grab, otherwise known as Neverninetofive. So what we're going to do is first of all jump into Instagram and check out his style, see what he does in the color grading, the basis of his look, and then in Lightroom we're going to implement that analysis into editing a photo and creating a preset out of it. So let's not waste any more time, let's jump into Instagram and check out his color grading. So here we have Maté Grab on Instagram, Neverninetofive if you want to go and follow him. And as you can see, he's a very talented individual. He's a digital designer turned into YouTuber, into filmmaker, photographer, and now he even does music, rap music about cameras. And you can find him on Spotify, YouTube, everywhere. Particularly if you check out his YouTube channel, his videos are just fantastic. The mood that he implements. He's a very creative person and I owe a lot of what my channel is and what my brand is to him because, well, I don't know him personally, but he did open my eyes into being a creative in YouTube in particular and creating a business out of it so I can live on. So he calls himself the LUT God or the preset God because he implemented a lot of this tendency of creating presets and LUTs, and I owe a lot of my business to him. So right here, if you want to check out his personal presets and LUTs, you can check out his shop over here and you can find, well, his direct style if that's the purpose of watching this video for you guys. If you want to just achieve his style, go and buy his presets directly or his LUTs. The purpose of my tutorials, remember, is to learn how to color grade, and we're just using profiles of famous people as an example. Now let's jump into breaking down his style. Now first of all, check out that his posts are very limited. He used to have quite a high amount of posts, but he went through some phases where he deleted or archived a lot of them. Now these first photos that we have over here, most of them, well, we're just going to skip them because all of these, well, with the exception maybe of this one and this one, were created with Midjourney. So these are not photos, these are basically AI generated portraits, as you can see right here. Hashtag Midjourney, he's been diving into AI a lot. And this is just outrageous. Just a little parenthesis, this is outrageous. Look at the quality of this portrait, which isn't even a photograph. It is created by AI and it's so realistic. It's so well edited as well. It just looks so real and it's quite frightening where AI is getting. There will be some point where I'm not going to be talking to you guys. It would be just an AI generated tutorial of myself. So let's go down through his style. And as you can see, as he's deleted a lot of his photos, his style is quite inconsistent in recent times. But if I think of Maté Grab, I think of two main styles. Well, I think a lot of styles because he's a very creative editor. But if we go down, we can see that a lot of his images, well, he was very famous at the time for creating Moody photography. So right here we have this set of images that you can see right here. These are the ones that I think of when I hear the name Maté Grab. This is a very moody and contrasty, punchy style, which is very unique to him. Now, this is the first style that I think of. He implemented a lot of his images with this type of editing. And then if we scroll down just a bit more, when he started to create some videos, this is a style that really was different to anything else that I was seeing on social media. And this is the one, this preset, I believe he calls it Wanderer, if you want to find it in his shop. But as you can see, it's a bit more faded, a bit more minimalistic, and it's very cold. So these are the two styles that we're going to break down today, just not to make this video eternal. So let's jump into specifics and let's break it down. So right here we have the Moody style, and as you can see, it's very punchy, very contrasty. You can see how the hair of Caroline, which is his girlfriend, has those highlights really amped up just a bit, and then in the shadows we're losing some information, but also he's raising a bit of the black so they're a bit more gray. Now another thing that you can notice over here, apart from the general desaturation of the colors, is that the skin tones have a lot of reddish tones. Now this is something that he does in camera calibration. He even mentions it in some of his tutorials. He amps up the green primary so we get a lot of the reddish tones in his skin. So maybe in some other tutorials I've mentioned this little trick, and I obtained it through a tutorial of him. Then in this one we can see it once again. You can see the reflections on the car, which are pure whites. There's no loss of information in the highlights. He's just keeping the whites as they are, and then the blacks he's raising them just a bit, but also the shadows he's bringing them down. So we have a loss of information in the shadows, but the highlights he's retaining them, so we have a very contrasty image. Now, another thing that we can see is that he adds some clarity into the image. That's why everything is a bit over sharp, a bit over texturized. So we're going to do that in the presence tab. Another thing, again, most of the colors, the blues are completely gone. In shadows, normally in asphalt roads, you can see that blue tint creeping in. It's completely desaturated. Also, the greens are a bit more muted. This image right here is basically his Moody style in essence. So here we can see how the blues are gone from the sky and the mountains in the background. The greens are desaturated and dim. Notice how there's a lot of loss of information in the shadows. And then the blacks are raised. So we don't see any pure blacks in this image, and it's a very muted, moody, and contrasty image. So this is the Moody style. Now let's check out the Wanderer style that we can see over here. And immediately we can notice that it's different. We can see how there's still that contrast because, well, the highlights are retained. We do have those pure whites as well. But now notice how the blacks are very faded, completely faded. They're basically gray. He's raising them up a lot. I did have this preset in my collection once, but I didn't like it at all, so I deleted it. And again, we have that desaturation on most of the tones, including some of the skin tones right here. The skin tones are very, very pale. And then if we jump into another one, we can notice that high contrast, the blacks are raised, but we're losing a lot of information in the shadows. We're losing some information in the highlights. That's telling me that he's raising the highlights just a bit. And also you can notice how there's this blue or cold cast added. We're going to do that in the color grading. Now in other images, like in these two, he umps up the highlights, so he has a more of a minimalistic image where we're losing all the detail that we could recover from the raw files in the clouds. So he's raising the highlights, so we have more of a contrasty image of the whites compared to the loss of information in the shadows. So as you can see, it's a very contrasty and desaturated but minimalistic style with high contrast and faded out blacks. So these are the two styles that we're going to replicate today, guys, just to not make this tutorial 30 minutes long, because he does have a lot of styles, but these are the two most iconic of him, in my opinion. So we're going to jump into Lightroom, but before that, I'm going to remind you that these two presets, my interpretation on his color grading, I'm going to add them into the Edit preset pack V2 in case you want to check it out and skip this tutorial and all the tutorials from this season. Link up here. You can find it in my shop. There's also the Edit V1 where you can find all the presets that we created in the past. So check the description just to verify that the style that you're looking for is in that pack. So if you can support me in any manner through my shop, I'll be very thankful. Now let's jump into Lightroom. Okay, creators, here in Lightroom I have several images that we can edit. Notice that all of them are shot in overcast or moody days, and that's just going to help us try to replicate his style if we have images shot in a similar situation. So I'm going to start off with this portrait. I think with D on your keyboard, you're going to go to the Develop tab. Okay, so let's start color grading. Now we're going to start off with the exposure and contrast. Now, if you've seen several tutorials from me, you notice that I have kind of a system. I like to go from top to bottom when it comes to the tabs. So right here we have, first of all, basic corrections, which is exposure and contrast, and the tone curve, and then we're going to move down into the color grading tools. Now remember that white balance, exposure, and contrast, these four values, I like to leave them at 0, not include them in the preset, because these are the values that I'm going to use to compensate any misfortunes or any missed shots on field. So if my image was too dark, I'll compensate the exposure. If the white balancing was off, I will use the temperature and tint. So I'm not going to add them to the preset. We're going to start off with the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Now, the first style that we're going to replicate is the Moody one. Then we're going to move on into the Wanderer. So first of all, what we want to do is the highlights and whites, I'm going to leave them just like that because we want to retain that natural contrast in the bright parts of our gamma. But in the shadows, we are going to bring them down as well as the black. So we're going to lose some information in the darkest parts of our image, but just making a lot more contrast in the general tone. So what we're going to do is pull down the shadows. So I'm going to pull them down. I don't want to go all the way to the -100, but around the let's say a -40, I think it's enough, something around those lines. And then the blacks will control the darkest parts of our image. So I'm not going to go all the way to the negatives, but something around, let's say around the -20 is going to be enough. And in this way, we're achieving a lot more contrast by having the highlights, well, basically just as they were. And then we're adding some loss of information in the shadows. Next, texture and clarity. Remember that I mentioned that he adds some clarity to add some punch into his image. He adds maybe 15 something is going to be enough. I don't like to go too high, but maybe we'll have to go back and modify this value. And texture, I'm just gonna add a similar value. And as you can notice, immediately our image is a lot more punchy and contrasty and sharp. Next, vibrance and saturation. In this case, I'm going to leave it like that. and we're going to move down to the tone curve. Now the tone curve is a very complex at first glance tool, so if you want to master this tool or any other tools that we're going to cover today, like color grading or camera calibration, you can find the tutorials dedicated to them on my channel. In this case, I'm not going to just explain too much on them, otherwise this video is going to be very long, and I already think it's going to be quite long. So what I'm going to do is create a point in the shadows and a point in the midtones. Now the points will basically control the exposure and contrast. You can also alter these points by moving the input and the output, which are basically their coordinates. Input is the x-axis and y is equivalent to the output. So for example, here in the shadows, I already have my notes over here. So if I point 59 and then I point 52 and hit enter, you can see that the point has shifted and now it's just below the diagonal, and this is what I want. I want to pull it down below the diagonal, just making a lot more contrast in the shadows, just lowering the shadows just a bit more. Then in this case, the brightest parts of our image, the highlights and the whites, I'm not going to touch them in this case, just going to leave them like that. But the blacks, I am going to move them up. I'm not going to fade them up all the way to this point. This is more similar to the Wonder preset, well, a bit exaggerated, but I'm just going to pull it down just around the output, around the 22%, just fade it out ever so slightly. And as you can notice, the blacks, now they're a bit more grayish, not an extreme, but they are more grayish compared to the original. So this is the tone curve. Now we're going to move down to the color grading. Now we're going to start off with HSL. Now HSL is, well, basically a tool that lets us alter the colors on our image. We can change the hue of specific colors to their nearest in the gamma curve. We can change the saturation and the luminance individually. Now we're going to start off by saturation. We want to desaturate a lot of the tones. So first of all, we're going to desaturate a bit of the oranges. Of course, we don't want to go to the extreme, otherwise the skin tones will be affected. As you can see, they're basically black and white. And normally the skin tones are in the red, orange and magenta range. In this case, I'm just going to pull it down just a bit around the -15, just to make the image a bit more opaque. Then yellows, as you can see, if I can move it up and down, control a lot of the greens on our images. So what I'm going to do is put it down around the -30%. I'm going to do the same with the greens, which will control a bit more of the darkest parts of the foliage. And then aquas as well. Remember, we didn't see any blues in the sky or anything like that with specific cases. So we want to bring it down, but we don't want to desaturate completely, for example, the blues. Otherwise, the outfit of our model is completely black and white. This is a bit too extreme. So we're going to pull it down just around the -30% as well. Something around these lines, just make them a bit less noticeable. And purples as well, I'm going to pull them down. Now, magentas, I'm not going to move them just in case some of the images that we apply this preset to have some purple in the lips. The magentas normally control the lips, normally control any dark part on the face of our model. So I'm going to leave it like that. Then we're going to move on to hue, and here I'm not going to do too much. This is a very simple edit. What I'm going to do is just change a bit of the greens. As we can notice, the greens are a bit too towards the blues. So what I'm going to do is just pull the greens towards the negatives, whoops, and as well as the yellows, and this is just gonna make the greens a bit more yellowish, something that we saw in his images. So we can deactivate HSL by clicking on the eye over here, and this is before and this is after, just making the image a lot more desaturated, a lot more moody. We're gonna skip color grading for this one. We're gonna move down all the way to effects. Now most of his images have some grain, some of them don't. In this case, I'm just going to add it just for purposes of the example. Now, the problem with grain that I have is that depending on the size of your image, the amount will vary, or the size will vary. So for example, right now I'm in an image which is 4000 times 6000 pixels, which is an APS-C image. And if I apply, let's say, a 54 grain right here, as you can see it's noticeable if we zoom in. If I apply this same amount of grain in my full frame images from my camera, well, the grain is going to be a lot smaller. So you have to take this into account. Maybe the grain in your images looks too small, or maybe it looks too big, and maybe you have to modify it and just play around. So right here I'm just going to add a very subtle amount of grain, around the 35%, but what I'm going to do is bring up the size around the 40%, something around these lines. So it's noticeable, it just adds a bit more texture, a bit more of an organic look, but you do have to pay attention and zoom in to really notice it. So it's not such a big problem. One thing that Christian used to add a lot in his images was a vignette. Now, I'm not too fond of vignetting. If you add a vignette, for example, right here, you can make really the attention go to the center of your image. What I like to do is instead add some masks, maybe some gradients, depending on the side where I want to darken the image. So it's a bit more specific. So I'm not going to add vignette for this tutorial. What I'm going to do is go all the way down to camera calibration. And right here, we're going to add that little tweak that we mentioned for the skin tones and make them a bit more bright. So as you can see, the hands of our model right here, they have a lot of red in them. So notice what happens if I pull up the saturation of the green primary. Notice how all those reds really start to pop a lot more. Now, this is a great method in which you can make the skin tones a bit more rich. So all the blemishes, all the blushes will really start to pop if you pull up the saturation on the green primary. Now, you may be asking why the green primary and not the red primary. The main purpose of this is that the green primary is direct opposite to the reds in the color wheel. So we are affecting the greens. As you can notice, they're a bit more saturated right now, but also the direct opposite, which are the reds. The same thing occurs if we do it to the blue primary. As you can see, if we move the saturation up, notice how the blues are a bit more intense. Let me move a bit of the hues to make it more evident. And as you can notice, the yellows really start to pop in the skin, making for this extreme teal and orange look. Now, why? Because blue primary is direct opposite to the yellow. So we're adding a lot more yellow and a lot more blue into our image by moving these sliders. Now, all these things, I covered them in the camera calibration tutorial. So I'm just going to reset the blues. I'm just going to add a bit of saturation into the green primary to make more emphasis on the skin tones. So I'm going to go with 13%. You can play around higher if you want. So right now the preset is finished, I think. So let's apply it to another image and let's see if we need to modify it or maybe add some things. So I'm going to go to the left panel over here, and under presets, I'm going to hit the plus sign and create preset. Now right here we want to name it, and remember that exposure, contrast, and white balance, we don't want to mark them. These are going to be left out of the preset, just as lens corrections and transform and also post-crop vignetting. So I'm going to create it. Okay, so we have this image. Let's apply the preset and see how it looks. We can just select it, and there we have it, and it's looking quite nice. Maybe in this case I would add a bit more to the clarity, maybe around 25%, just to add a bit more punch, but it's looking quite nice. We can see those greens that are a lot more muted. We can see that contrast that we were looking for. It's a lot more than in the original, while retaining the contrast in the brightest parts of our image. Let's see in another image. Oh yeah, if you modify your preset, if you want to modify it or update it, you can always just select your preset, right click, and update with current settings. Okay, how about in this image where I'm just about to jump off the cliff of this volcano? Let's apply the preset, and there we have it. It's a lot more contrasty, a lot more moody, and I think it works quite well. A bit more desaturated, yeah, but it's looking quite nice. I think we did a good job. How about in this portrait of my friend Kevin? Let's apply the Moody preset, and as you can see, the blues are basically gone. This is similar to the thing that I was talking about of the blues in the shadows in the asphalt of the example image. Now you can notice how the blues are gone in this image, and it's a lot more muted, desaturated. We did a good job with the greens in particular. It's looking very similar to the greens that we saw in his images. And right here, well, our model has more of a brownish skin tone, but as you can notice, there's a lot more red in the skin, and that's just a product of what we did in camera calibration. It's a very subtle move, but it really adds. And we have that contrast and those faded out blacks. It's looking quite nice. So let's move back to the first image that we started editing to create the other preset. Now we're going to create a variant on this style, so we don't have to start from scratch. So what I want to do is just alter this preset to make it look like the other style. Now the key differences is the exposure and contrast. So first of all, the other style had a bit more of blown out highlights, but also it had a faded out look in the blacks. So let's start off by altering the contrast. First of all, the highlights, I'm just going to put it up around 20% just to make a bit more of a minimalistic image, just losing a bit of detail in the clouds, for example, in certain images. Then the shadows, I'm going to pull it down a lot more. We're going to lose a lot more information in the shadows in this style, around the -60. But the blacks, I'm going to return them just a bit, ever so slightly, around the 16-15%, just to make the image a lot more flat. Next, texture clarity, I'm just going to leave it like that. What I am going to modify is the tone curve. Now, first of all, the shadows, I'm going to pull them up above the diagonal in this case. So up, you can see how the image is a lot more flat. We're losing that harsh contrast, something around these lines. And then the blacks, remember that they were very, very faded with this style. So I'm going to put it up, not too much, not in this case, this is way too much. Just going to put it up maybe around the 31 or 30%. in the output, something around these lines. And as you can notice, our image immediately is a lot more faded and a lot more flat. And notice how the blacks are basically gray in this case. Next, we're going to move down to color grading. Now, color grading, we didn't add it to the previous preset. It was a bit more natural. In this case, we're going to add that cool tint into maybe the shadows, the midtones, or to the highlights. So color grading is a great tool because, well, it lets you just add a tint into any of these parts of the image, or with a global color wheel over here, a tint to the entire image. So this is a great way to create variance on your style. You can maybe create a preset with maybe a brownish tint, then you can add some blues, then you can create another one with some greens. This is a great tool, a very complete tool within Lightroom. So in this case, I'm gonna add the blue tint into the shadows. Why not the midtones and highlights? Well, the highlights were pure whites, and then, well, the midtones control the skin tone. So I don't want to add that blue tone into any of those parts. I'm gonna add it to the shadows. So I'm gonna add some saturation just to search for the color that I want, maybe around these lines, and then just pull it down, not too much. It's a very subtle edit, but it's gonna be noticeable. Around the saturation of 12%, and the hue is 223 if you want to check it out. So we can click this button on and off to see what it's done. And this is before. You can notice how the image has this warm tint, and now it's a bit more cool. This is what we were looking for. Now, next for this preset, the grain, well, it's not noticeable. There's basically no grain in the images from Christian with this style. They're a lot more clean. So in effect, I'm just going to reset the grain all the way to 0. Just make the image a lot more natural. And then finally, remember that the skin tones were a lot more flat in this style. So in camera calibration, I'm just going to reset the saturation over here. I'm going to save this preset and see if we did a good job in another image. Okay, so in this image, we have the Moody preset applied. It's looking quite nice. Now let's apply the Wonder preset. As you can see, both of them are now in the like V2. So I'm going to apply it, and it actually looks quite nice. It's very flat, very desaturated. Notice how the blacks are very faded out, and it's looking very nice. We can no longer see those harsh reddish tones in the skin tones. It's a lot more neutral. I think we did a good job. Let's see in another image. Have this ridiculous portrait of myself with some binoculars. First of all, let's see how the Moody looks, a lot more punchy. And now let's see the Wonder, and the Wonder looks very nice in this image in particular. That blue cast that we added in the color grading really works, but also how it's a lot more flat and faded. Notice how the sky is brighter than the original. That's the changes that we did in the basic corrections, but it's looking quite nice. Notice how the skin tones are a bit more desaturated. That was something that we were looking for as well. How about in this one where I was about to commit suicide? Let's apply, and the Wonder looks very nice in this image in particular. Finally, let's see in this portrait, let's apply first of all the Moody, which is a lot more punchy. Notice how the skin is a bit more rough just because we added some texture and some clarity, but notice how the Wonder just really makes the image a lot more soft. Now in this case, well, in this time when Christian was creating this style and applying it to all his feed, what he did is add a lot of vignette. Now I don't like to add vignette, but you could add some vignette over here just to make more emphasis on the central subject. Just feather it out just a bit, and the midpoint just drag it closer to the subject, and it's looking fantastic. This image looks very nice. So guys, remember that these two presets that we just created, I've already added them into the Edit Like Preset Pack V2 in case you want to support me. And remember that this is just my interpretation on his color grading, how I would achieve these types of edits. I know that he doesn't use this method because I've seen tutorials of him, I've owned presets from him, and he basically doesn't leave any slider without moving. He moves every single one of them, so he's a very complex editor. This is just my interpretation. It's a bit more of a simpler process how I would achieve this type of color grading, but I hope you understood a bit of my system. I always like to implement systems so I can edit images or styles in a consistent manner. So starting out with the analysis, then go exposure and contrast, then move down to color grading, and then finishing touches, and then try the preset on an image and see if it passes all the tests. So that's just my system, so I can edit, will it be this style, will it be another tutorial, will it be clients work in a similar manner, and knowing how to work and not be all over the place with the program. So I highly recommend you guys to develop your own system, or just copy mine if you want to. And that's gonna be it for today, guys. The video is very long right now. I'm looking at the timer. I'll see you in the next one. Subscribe, all those things. I'm Tony Fuentes. Cheers to all of you, and see you in the next one.